The sands of the Nile carried with them not just the stories of kings and pyramids, but also the quieter, almost invisible rituals of everyday people, rituals that had little to do with warfare or dynasties, and everything to do with how one looked, smelled, and was perceived in the slow procession of daily life. When you imagine ancient Egypt, it is tempting to picture monumental structures and powerful pharaohs commanding thousands of workers. Yet, beneath that surface, ordinary men and women were concerned with something far more intimate: how their bodies appeared to one another. Beauty, in its various forms, was not simply a matter of vanity. It was tied to ideas of cleanliness, spirituality, health, and even moral order. To the Egyptians, the body was a vessel for the soul, and maintaining it in an appealing way was part of maintaining cosmic balance, or ma'at. So, what did beauty mean in this desert kingdom thousands of years ago? You might imagine elaborate wigs and painted eyes, but the details were far more curious. Beauty was not only a luxury for the elite. Across classes, Egyptians invested in appearance with surprising devotion. Archaeological finds reveal that even modest households stored pots of oils, combs, and fragments of mineral-based pigments. These were not tools for survival in the harsh desert climate, but tools for something subtler: survival of social standing, desirability, and identity. One of the most iconic images of ancient Egyptian beauty is the heavily outlined eye. Black kohl, applied in precise lines, gave the eyes an almond shape that has echoed across centuries of art. But this was not merely a fashion choice. Kohl was believed to protect the wearer from the harsh glare of the sun. It reduced eye infections in a land where dust and sand were constant irritants. Modern chemical studies of preserved kohl have revealed traces of lead salts, which, counterintuitively, may have boosted the immune system of those who wore it. In this way, vanity and practicality blended seamlessly. You were not simply painting your face for appearance, you were defending your health, too. The preparation of cosmetics, however, was anything but glamorous. Black kohl was produced by grinding galena, a lead-based mineral, into a fine powder. This required laborious effort with stone mortars. In wealthier households, servants might do this grinding daily, keeping a family's cosmetic stock fresh. But in humbler homes, one imagines individuals sitting by small oil lamps, crushing minerals in steady, repetitive motions. Imagine that sound, the scraping of stone against stone, the faint scent of oil and earth filling the air, a routine both ordinary and essential. Kohl was stored in small containers, often beautifully carved from ivory, wood, or clay. Some were simple, cylindrical tubes. Others were more elaborate, shaped into animals or inscribed with protective hieroglyphs. Alongside these, slender applicators of bone or reed were used to draw the fine lines. Applying kohl was a careful ritual, performed with mirrors of polished copper or bronze. The mirror would catch the soft light of dawn filtering into mud brick homes, reflecting back the tired faces of farmers, artisans, or noblewomen. Each line drawn was an act of transformation, turning the raw human face into something that aligned with Egyptian ideals of beauty and divine order. But eye makeup was only the beginning. Skin care was equally important. In a hot, arid environment, dry skin was a constant irritation. Oils were the solution, and they were used liberally. Olive oil, castor oil, and animal fats were blended with aromatic ingredients to produce balms. These substances kept the skin supple, but they also carried powerful associations of luxury. The wealthy perfumed their oils with frankincense or myrrh, resins imported across long trade routes. To apply such a balm was to signal both refinement and access to the distant corners of the world. For those with fewer resources, simpler mixtures sufficed. A common household might rely on unperfumed animal fat, rubbed into the skin after long days in the sun. The smell was less pleasant, the texture more coarse, yet the act was the same, maintaining the body, keeping it from withering in the desert heat. In this sense, even the poorest Egyptians shared in the rituals of beauty that bound society together. Hair, too, was a canvas of beauty. Baldness was common in both men and women, not from genetics, but from deliberate choice. Shaving the head was a hygienic practice, protecting against lice and the relentless heat. But it also made wigs central to Egyptian identity. Wigs were crafted with great care from human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers, and then treated with beeswax to hold their shape. The wealthy commissioned elaborate wigs styled in intricate braids and adorned with beads or gold ornaments. Poorer Egyptians used simpler versions, but even those reflected the broader cultural ideal. Hair was not something given by nature, but something shaped by artifice. Imagine the storage rooms of a noble household, rows of wigs resting on stands, combs laid neatly beside them, jars of beeswax lined up like soldiers in a row. Each wig had a purpose. One for daily wear, one for religious ceremonies, another for festivals. Wigs allowed one to transform identity as easily as changing clothing. To appear in public without one would have been unthinkable, a kind of social nakedness. Fragrance was another cornerstone of Egyptian beauty. In a world without modern plumbing, managing odor was a constant battle. Incense burned in homes, temples, and workshops, masking less pleasant smells. People wore cones of scented fat on their heads during festivals, strange waxy lumps that slowly melted in the sun, releasing perfumed oils down the hair and body. What may seem bizarre to us was, for them, an accepted and even celebrated method of smelling sweet in a crowded gathering. Jewelry, too, carried a strong role in the construction of beauty. Necklaces, bracelets, and earrings were not just decorations but symbols of protection. Amulets shaped like scarabs or the eye of Horus promised to ward off misfortune. Beads of turquoise, carnelian, and lapis lazuli added splashes of color against linen garments. These objects shimmered in candlelight and sunlight alike, turning the body into a moving display of both aesthetic appeal and spiritual safeguard. It is important to remember that Egyptian beauty ideals were not uniform. There were shifting trends across centuries. In the Old Kingdom, slender forms with small waists were praised. By the New Kingdom, fuller figures and rounded faces became the ideal, reflecting shifts in wealth and abundance. Beauty was not static, it changed with the tides of history, even in a civilization that prized continuity. And yet, one thread remained constant: beauty was a form of balance. It was never about excess but about harmony. The perfectly drawn eye, the smooth skin, the neatly braided wig, these were all signals that a person was aligned with Ma'at. Disorder in appearance reflected disorder in life. To neglect beauty was, in a sense, to neglect one's duty to the gods. The most fascinating aspect of all is how deeply beauty rituals cut across class lines. The pharaoh might be buried with golden ointment jars, while a farmer's wife might keep her kohl in a clay pot. But both participated in the same fundamental actions: grinding, applying, perfuming, adorning. Beauty was not a privilege of the few, it was a shared rhythm of life. As you think about these details, perhaps a question lingers: what did it feel like, day after day, to engage in these small, careful acts of self-presentation? Was it a joy, a burden, or simply as natural as breathing? The answer is lost to time, buried with those who lived it. And so, as we close this first section, the question remains. If the first glimpse of Egyptian beauty lay in the familiar rituals of kohl and oils, the deeper layers unfold when we look at the systems that supported these practices, the workshops, the artisans, the trade networks, and the cultural meanings woven into every jar of ointment and strand of wig. To understand beauty in ancient Egypt, you must imagine not just the finished appearance of an individual but the entire infrastructure that made that appearance possible. Behind every painted eye was the miner extracting the lina from the desert. Behind every perfumed oil was the merchant sailing up the Nile with resins from far-off lands. Beauty was not an isolated act, it was the endpoint of an enormous, often invisible chain of labor. Take cosmetics, for example. Archaeological digs in places like Amarna and Giza have uncovered small workshops dedicated to grinding and mixing pigments. In these dim, dusty rooms, workers used basalt or limestone mortars to crush minerals into powders. The process was monotonous, requiring endless grinding until the coarse chunks became silky dust. Then, powders were sifted and stored in containers before being mixed with animal fats or vegetable oils. Nothing about this process was glamorous. It was repetitive, noisy, and physically demanding. And yet, it was essential. Without the grind of anonymous artisans, no noblewoman could trace black lines across her eyelids. Oils and perfumes required a different kind of labor. Fields along the Nile provided flax for oil extraction, while animal fats were byproducts of butchering. Aromatic ingredients, however, often came from distant regions. Frankincense and myrrh were imported from Punt, a mysterious land to the south. Cinnamon and cassia may have traveled all the way from India. These rare ingredients made perfumes costly luxuries. To an ordinary farmer, the scent of simple castor oil might suffice. But to the elite, perfumed oils were symbols of power. When Queen Hatshepsut famously sent expeditions to Punt, she was not only seeking gold or exotic animals, she was ensuring a steady flow of aromatic resins to sustain the rituals of beauty and temple worship alike. The making of wigs, too, depended on hidden layers of labor. Human hair was collected from donors or servants, sometimes purchased outright. Sheep's wool was cleaned and dyed, while plant fibers were softened and treated with beeswax. Artisans then braided and knotted these materials into elaborate constructions. The work was painstaking, requiring both skill and patience. Finished wigs were not merely functional, they were works of art, carrying hours of unseen effort. Imagine rows of workers, hands busy with strands of hair, the air filled with the faint sweetness of beeswax, the slow murmur of conversations drifting between them as they worked. Even jewelry, often admired today for its dazzling appearance, was bound to this system of effort. Semi-precious stones like turquoise and carnelian came from Sinai or the eastern desert, requiring dangerous mining expeditions. Gold was extracted from Nubian deserts, where laborers endured searing heat to chip or from rocky cliffs. Once raw materials reached workshops, artisans spent weeks polishing, drilling, and stringing beads. Every bracelet and necklace was thus a condensation of countless hours of labor, travel, and trade. What this reveals is that beauty in Egypt was not simply individual, it was collective. A noble's striking appearance was built upon the sweat and skill of hundreds of anonymous hands. The very act of adorning oneself was an act of participation in a vast economic and cultural web. But beauty was also tied to belief. To the Egyptians, outward appearance reflected inner harmony. The gods themselves were depicted with perfect, symmetrical features, smooth skin, and youthful vigor. To appear beautiful was, in some sense, to imitate the divine. This is why beauty extended even into death. Tombs of nobles often contained cosmetic palettes, jars of oils, combs, and jewelry, ensuring that the deceased would remain beautiful in the afterlife. In this way, beauty was not fleeting, it was eternal, a preparation for eternity itself. Consider the famous bust of Nefertiti. Discovered in Amarna, it portrays the queen with elongated features, graceful neck, and perfectly painted eyes. But scholars suggest this was not simply a portrait. It was an idealized image, projecting what beauty ought to be rather than what it truly was. This blending of reality and ideal ran through Egyptian art as a whole. Even ordinary tomb paintings show men and women with smooth skin, elegant postures, and symmetrical faces. Wrinkles, blemishes, and imperfections were rarely depicted. In life and in art, beauty was less about individuality and more about embodying an eternal, harmonious form. Yet, there is another layer to this story, the everyday maintenance of beauty. Imagine waking up in a mud brick house along the Nile. The air is cool before the heat of the day arrives. A woman sits on a low stool, her servant bringing a mirror of polished copper. She dips her reed applicator into a pot of kohl, carefully tracing the line along her eyelids. Another servant combs through a wig, smoothing strands with beeswax. She rubs oil into her arms and legs, the scent of frankincense rising faintly. Each action is slow, methodical, repeated day after day. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just the steady rhythm of keeping oneself aligned with society's ideals. For men, too, grooming was essential. Shaving the face and head was common, though some preferred finely trimmed beards for ceremonial occasions. Linen garments were laundered and pressed, whiteness itself being a marker of cleanliness and refinement. Men used kohl just as women did, and they applied oils to their bodies. Beauty was not gendered in the way it often is today. Both sexes shared in the rituals, both equally invested in presenting an idealized form of the self. Religious spaces also reinforced these ideals. Priests in temples were required to maintain strict standards of cleanliness and grooming. They shaved their bodies completely, bathed several times a day, and applied oils before performing rituals. Beauty, in this context, was inseparable from piety. To neglect one's body was to risk impurity in the eyes of the gods. Even the statues of deities were cared for as though they were living beings, washed, anointed with oils, and adorned with fresh linens and jewelry. This daily maintenance of divine images mirrored the maintenance of human bodies. Both gods and mortals participated in the same cycle of beautification. It is fascinating to think how much of Egyptian life was dedicated to these small, repetitive acts. Grinding pigments, combing wigs, polishing mirrors, washing linens. The grandeur of temples and tombs may dominate our imagination, but in the daily lives of Egyptians, these quiet acts of grooming consumed far more time. They were boring, yes, but also profoundly significant. For to neglect them was to fall out of harmony, not only with society but with the divine order itself. And yet, questions linger. Were these beauty standards oppressive, creating constant pressure to maintain an impossible ideal? Or did they provide comfort, giving order and rhythm to life in a harsh environment? Did people truly feel beautiful, or was beauty simply another obligation, like paying taxes or irrigating fields? The fragments we have, cosmetic palettes, mirrors, wigs, jewelry, cannot answer these questions fully. They speak of what was done, but not always why it was felt. They show us the tools, but not the emotions that accompanied their use. And so, as we leave this section, the question remains. By now, we've traced the details of Egyptian beauty from the grinding of minerals to the scent of perfumed oils, from the wigs on noble heads to the jewelry adorning even the poorest wrists. But to conclude this first story, we must look at the broader meaning of beauty in Egypt, the way it wove itself into the fabric of social life, gender roles, afterlife beliefs, and the curious ways in which its influence still lingers in our world today. When you step back, what is most striking is how beauty in Egypt was never a private pursuit. It was public. To be seen was to exist. Appearance shaped one's reputation in a world where social bonds were tight and communities small. A well-kept body signaled discipline, prosperity, and alignment with divine ideals. An unkempt appearance suggested disorder, perhaps even moral failing. Beauty was a language, silently communicating who you were before you even spoke. Marriage rituals, for example, were steeped in these ideals. Ancient Egyptian love poetry, preserved on papyrus fragments, often praises physical traits, smooth skin, bright eyes, fragrant breath. A young woman's beauty was compared to lotus flowers blooming on the Nile. A man's appeal was linked to his scent and cleanliness. In a society where arranged marriages were common, beauty was both an asset and an expectation. Cosmetics and perfumes were not luxuries here, they were part of courtship, just as important as lineage or dowry. Festivals provided another stage for beauty. During celebrations honoring Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, men and women adorned themselves in their finest wigs, jewelry, and linens. They wore scented cones of fat that slowly melted throughout the day, releasing fragrance in crowded gatherings. Imagine the scene, music from harps and flutes, dancers moving gracefully, laughter rising into the warm evening air, and all around, the mingling scents of perfume and incense. Beauty here was not about solemnity but joy, an exuberant declaration of life. At the same time, ideals of beauty carried subtle power dynamics. The elite could afford the finest materials, kohl mixed with exotic oils, wigs braided with gold, jewelry set with rare stones. Commoners, by contrast, made do with simpler versions. And yet, both rich and poor engaged in the same rituals. A farmer's wife might grind malachite for green eye paint just as a queen did. The difference lay not in the act itself, but in the quality of materials. This shared participation suggests that beauty was a cultural glue. It bound society together, even as it reflected divisions of wealth and status. Perhaps most fascinating is how beauty extended into the afterlife. Egyptians believed that to live forever, one must be preserved not only in body but also in appearance. Mummies were carefully wrapped, faces painted with cosmetics, wigs placed on skulls, and jewelry laid across chests. Tombs were stocked with ointments and perfumes, ensuring that the deceased would remain beautiful for eternity. Beauty was not fleeting here, it was eternal, part of one's immortal identity. Consider again the tomb of Queen Nefertari, wife of Ramses II. Its walls are filled with images of her, painted with flawless skin, bright eyes outlined in kohl, and elaborate jewelry. These were not casual decorations. They were eternal affirmations of her beauty, ensuring that she would be recognized and revered in the afterlife. In this way, Egyptian beauty transcended time. It was not about aging gracefully or keeping up with fashion. It was about fixing oneself permanently in the order of the cosmos. What is equally curious is how many of these practices echo in our modern world. The black eyeliner we still use today has its roots in Egyptian kohl. The idea of wigs as fashion accessories, perfumes as markers of identity, and jewelry as symbols of love and protection, all trace back to Egypt's boring rituals. Even the link between health and beauty, so central to our modern skincare industry, was anticipated in the Egyptians' use of oils to protect their skin from the desert climate. Their world feels remote, but its echoes are alive every time someone applies makeup in front of a mirror. And yet, the Egyptian pursuit of beauty also raises timeless questions. Did these rituals truly bring satisfaction, or did they create endless striving for ideals that could never be fully reached? Was a noblewoman reassured when she gazed at her painted reflection, or did she, like many of us today, wonder if it was enough? Were these routines acts of empowerment, allowing people to craft their identities, or acts of conformity, forcing them into molds shaped by society and religion? The truth is, we will never know exactly how an Egyptian woman felt as she adjusted her wig or how a farmer felt as he applied kohl before going out to work. The artifacts tell us what they did, but not how it felt. Perhaps, like us, they carried a mix of emotions: pride, anxiety, pleasure, duty. Perhaps the rituals brought comfort, a sense of order in a world where life was often short and uncertain. And so, as we close this first story, the lesson seems to be that beauty, even in its most ordinary and boring details, is never just about vanity. It is about identity, power, spirituality, and survival. In ancient Egypt, beauty was a way of aligning oneself with the gods, of signaling belonging to society, of preparing for eternity. It was never trivial. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most enduring legacies of their civilization. As you drift on this thought, let one final question linger. When you think of cleanliness today, you might imagine showers, soap, and flowing tap water. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness looked very different, yet it carried as much, if not more, importance. To the Egyptians, the body was not merely a vessel for living. It was a sacred space, tied directly to health, beauty, and the gods. To be clean was to be in harmony with the world. To be dirty was to risk both sickness and spiritual imbalance. The Nile was at the center of everything. It fed the land, carried goods, and sustained communities. But it also provided the water for washing. Morning routines often began with trips to the river or to smaller household basins filled with Nile water. Unlike in many ancient cultures where bathing was rare, Egyptians valued frequent washing. The heat of the desert climate demanded it. Dust, sweat, and insects were constant irritants, and water was the most effective defense. Households kept simple clay jars and bowls for washing. Archaeological remains suggest that even modest homes contained stone basins or pottery vessels for holding water. Wealthier homes featured more elaborate setups, sometimes with built-in drains that carried water outside. Washing the face, hands, and feet was a daily necessity. Entire bodies might be rinsed in the river itself. Imagine the rhythm of this life: men and women dipping their hands into cool basins at dawn, children splashing by the riverbank, priests performing ritual cleansings before sunrise prayers. Cleanliness was not an occasional luxury, it was woven into the daily pattern of existence. Soap, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, Egyptians used a kind of paste made from natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt harvested from dry lake beds. Natron was the same substance used in mummification, prized for its ability to preserve and purify. Mixed with water and oils, it became a crude but effective cleansing agent. For hair, mixtures of clay and ash may have served as shampoos, though coarse. By modern standards, these substances carried the same purpose, stripping away dirt and keeping the body fresh. Hygiene was closely tied to shaving. Unlike many ancient cultures that celebrated beards, Egyptians prized smooth, hairless skin. Men shaved their faces and heads, while women removed body hair with bronze razors or depilatory creams made of honey and crushed limestone. The reasons were partly practical: lice thrived in unwashed hair under the hot sun. But they were also symbolic. A shaved body was considered clean, pure, and aligned with divine order. Priests took this to an extreme. Before performing temple rituals, they shaved every hair from their bodies, including eyebrows and lashes. They bathed multiple times a day in sacred pools, anointing themselves with oils afterward. These practices were not optional. They were requirements for approaching the gods. Cleanliness here was not only about health, it was about holiness. Perfumed oils were another cornerstone of hygiene. After bathing or washing, people rubbed oils into their skin. This softened the body, protected it from the harsh desert climate, and masked odors. Without deodorant, sweat was a constant concern, and oils mixed with resins provided relief. The wealthy imported exotic fragrances, cinnamon, cardamom, and frankincense, while common people relied on local plants like morina or castor. In either case, oiling the body was part of daily hygiene, much as moisturizing is today. Clothing also reflected cleanliness. Egyptians wore linen, a fabric made from the flax plant. Linen was light, breathable, and easy to wash. White linen garments were especially prized, symbolizing purity. Workers might wear coarse, undyed versions, but wealthier Egyptians wore bleached and finely woven linen. Laundry was a routine task, with riverbanks serving as communal washing places. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed with sand, and beaten against rocks, then left to dry in the sun. The sound of garments snapping against stone must have echoed daily along the Nile, a reminder that hygiene extended beyond the body to what covered it. Even within homes, cleanliness mattered. Floors were swept, storage jars sealed to keep pests out, and incense burned to mask unpleasant odors. Simple tools, brooms of palm fiber, mats that could be shaken free of dust, were part of every household. Larger estates employed servants to carry water, wash linens, and prepare scented oils. In more modest homes, the same tasks fell to family members. Life was dusty, yes, but people worked constantly to push back against the grime of the desert. There was also a medical dimension to hygiene. Egyptian medical papyri described treatments for body odor, lice, and skin conditions. Recipes included mixtures of honey, herbs, and natron, applied to keep the body fresh. Some remedies blurred the line between hygiene and magic. Amulets against disease were often worn alongside the use of oils or baths. Cleanliness, medicine, and religion were intertwined, different expressions of the same desire to protect the body. Festivals added another layer. Before great celebrations, Egyptians bathed, shaved, and perfumed themselves. To appear dirty at a festival honoring the gods would have been unthinkable. Cleanliness was part of showing respect, both to fellow humans and to the divine. Imagine the collective scent, thousands of people gathered in temples, their bodies glistening with oils, the air thick with incense and perfume. These festivals must have been overwhelming to the senses, a blending of sound, smell, and sight that reinforced the role of hygiene in Egyptian identity. And yet, for all their devotion to cleanliness, Egyptians faced limitations. Water was plentiful along the Nile, but not everywhere. In desert villages far from the river, hygiene was more difficult. Soap pastes could be harsh on the skin, and oils were not always affordable. Even in cities, pests and disease spread despite efforts to stay clean. The pursuit of cleanliness was constant but never fully complete. Still, what stands out is how seriously Egyptians took it. Other ancient cultures often treated bathing as occasional or ceremonial. In Egypt, it was daily life. To live along the Nile was to live in cycles of washing, shaving, oiling, and laundering. It was ordinary, repetitive, even boring. But it was also essential, both for survival in the desert climate and for maintaining one's place in society. As you picture these daily rituals, you might wonder, did people feel pride in their cleanliness, or was it simply routine? Did a farmer, after scrubbing himself with natron paste, feel renewed, or was it just another task before the day's labor began? The answer is hidden in the quiet rhythms of their world. All we know is that for the Egyptians, hygiene was not a matter of choice. It was life itself. And so, as we close this first section, let one question linger: if daily bathing, shaving, and oiling kept Egyptians outwardly clean, the deeper truth of hygiene lies in the systems of belief, labor, and ritual that supported these habits. To the Egyptians, cleanliness was never only about comfort. It was a matter of order, a way of maintaining harmony with both society and the divine. To see this more clearly, you must imagine the infrastructure of cleanliness. Take water, for instance. For most households, water had to be carried from the Nile in clay jars. This was heavy work, often done by servants or women of the household. Large estates employed teams of water carriers, moving back and forth between river and house, ensuring basins were filled for washing and laundry. Even in ordinary homes, this chore shaped daily life. A man might return from the fields covered in dust, while his wife prepared a basin for him to rinse before eating. In every corner of society, the presence of clean water marked the rhythm of living. Soap pastes and detergents, though simple, reveal much about Egyptian ingenuity. Natron mixed with ash or crushed limestone made effective cleansing powders. These could be harsh on the skin, so people balanced them with oils afterward. Laundry practices show a similar duality. Garments were scrubbed with sand or natron, then softened by sun and repeated rinsing. The result was a society where linen garments remained bright, reflecting light in the desert sun, a visible sign of cleanliness and order. Barbers and bath attendants formed a quiet but essential profession. Records and tomb paintings show men cutting hair, trimming beards, and assisting in shaving rituals. These workers likely traveled from household to household, carrying razors, combs, and small jars of oil. To hire a barber was not only practical but also social, a chance to maintain one's appearance in line with cultural expectations. Even in villages, there must have been individuals skilled in hair removal and grooming, offering their services to neighbors. The very existence of such occupations reminds us that hygiene was not left to chance, it was structured into the fabric of society. Priestly hygiene carried this to its highest form. In temples, priests performed rituals only after repeated purification. They bathed in sacred lakes or pools, shaved their bodies, and applied oils before entering shrines. The god they served was expected to exist in a space of purity, and the priest's body mirrored this requirement. Even the statues of gods were treated as living beings, washed, perfumed, and clothed in fresh linen daily. This constant attention blurred the line between human hygiene and divine care. To bathe and anoint oneself was, in a sense, to imitate the very rituals performed for the gods. Medical texts add another layer. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents, describes remedies for body odor, lice, and skin conditions. Mixtures of herbs, honey, and natron were recommended to prevent smells or heal rashes. The line between medicine and hygiene was thin. Was a paste of honey and natron a deodorant, or a medical treatment? Likely both. To the Egyptians, good health was inseparable from cleanliness. Disease was linked to disorder, and order could be restored by washing, shaving, and perfuming. Smell played a particularly important role. In a hot climate without modern sanitation, odor was constant. Egyptians responded by elevating fragrance into an art. Perfumes were made by steeping flowers, herbs, or resins in oils, then filtering them through cloth. Laboratories attached to temples experimented with blends, producing complex scents. Some were reserved for gods, others for kings and queens. But even common people made simple versions, lotus petals in oil, or crushed herbs mixed with fat. These scents masked sweat, but they also carried symbolic power. Sweet smell was linked to purity and divinity, while foul smell suggested decay and moral corruption. In this way, hygiene extended beyond appearance into the invisible realm of scent. Festivals magnified this importance. During celebrations, worshippers crowded into temples, their bodies perfumed, their hair shaved or wigged, their linen freshly washed. To appear otherwise would have been shameful. These moments of collective cleanliness reinforced social unity. Thousands of people, each maintaining their bodies in the same ways, formed a living reflection of order. Imagine the sight: processions of dancers and musicians, priests carrying statues of gods, and behind them, ordinary Egyptians glistening with oil, fragrant cones melting on their heads, their appearance unified by ritual. Cleanliness was not just individual, it was communal. Even in death, hygiene remained central. Mummification itself was a grand act of purification. Bodies were washed with palm wine, scrubbed with natron, shaved, and anointed with oils before being wrapped. Funerary jars held ointments and perfumes, ensuring that the deceased remained clean for eternity. The very substances used in daily life, natron, oils, resins, became sacred tools of preservation. What was ordinary in life became extraordinary in death, linking personal hygiene to cosmic survival. Yet, beneath all this, there were practical struggles. Natron could irritate skin, oils could attract insects, and lice were never fully eliminated despite shaving. Even the wealthiest Egyptians must have felt the constant battle against the desert, dust settling on freshly washed skin, sweat dampening linen garments by midday. Cleanliness was never perfect. It was a goal chased daily, always slipping slightly out of reach. And so we are left to wonder, did Egyptians think of hygiene as a burden, or as a source of pride? Did a priest bathing for the third time that day feel weary, or elevated? Did a farmer scrubbing his linen by the river feel frustration, or reassurance that he was part of the same rhythms as nobles and kings? The silence of archaeology cannot answer these feelings. It leaves us only with the evidence of practice, the jars, the razors, the perfumes. Yet in their persistence, repeated across centuries, we glimpse something more. Hygiene was not simply tolerated. It was embraced. It was part of what it meant to be Egyptian. And so, as this section ends, a question remains. We have walked through the Nile-side basins, into homes where natron paste was rubbed on skin, through temples where priests shaved themselves bare, and even into tombs where oils and perfumes were laid beside the dead. But to conclude this story, we must now step back and see the full picture. Why did hygiene matter so much to the Egyptians, and what lasting legacy did it leave? At the heart of Egyptian hygiene lies the concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed every aspect of life. Ma'at was balance, harmony, and truth. To live within Ma'at was to keep oneself aligned with both society and the gods. Cleanliness was a visible, tangible way of expressing this alignment. A clean body reflected a clean soul. Disorder, filth, and neglect were not just unattractive, they were signs of spiritual imbalance. This belief stretched across classes. A peasant might not afford fine oils or imported perfumes, but he could still wash in the Nile, scrub his linen with sand, and shave his head to keep away lice. These actions were both practical and symbolic. They spoke to a shared understanding: the gods favored those who maintained themselves in order. In this way, hygiene was democratized. It was one of the few cultural practices that touched every level of society, from pharaohs to farmers. Yet, for the elite, hygiene carried political weight as well. Pharaohs were often depicted in pristine white linen, their faces smooth, their bodies perfumed. This was not vanity. It was propaganda. A clean, shining body symbolized divine favor. To appear unkempt would have undermined the pharaoh's image as the living embodiment of Horus. Even foreign visitors remarked on Egyptian refinement, noting how carefully the people tended to their appearance. To outsiders, Egypt's devotion to hygiene must have seemed almost excessive, but within Egypt it was proof of civilization itself. Priestly rituals amplified this symbolism. To shave every hair and bathe multiple times a day was to separate oneself from the ordinary, to live in a state of constant purity. The temple was not only a place of worship but a carefully maintained bubble of cleanliness. Sacred lakes provided water for repeated washings, oils perfumed the air, and incense masked impurities. Statues of gods, washed and clothed daily, mirrored the people themselves. The divine was imagined not as distant and untouchable, but as sharing in the same rituals of cleansing and renewal. This same pattern is visible in Egyptian attitudes toward death. To wash, shave, and perfume the body in life prepared one for the same treatments in death. Mummification was the ultimate act of hygiene, preserving order against the chaos of decay. The wrapping of a body in clean linen, the application of oils and resins, the careful removal of hair, all echoed the daily routines of the living. Death did not erase hygiene, it magnified it, ensuring that the deceased would remain pure for eternity. Consider the tomb of Tutankhamun. Among the treasures found were jars of perfumed oils, razors, and fine linen. These were not luxuries meant for the living but provisions for the afterlife. Even a young king, who died suddenly, was surrounded by the tools of cleanliness. To be unclean in the afterlife would have been unthinkable. The body had to be as fresh, smooth, and perfumed as it had been in life, if not more so. It is easy to dismiss these practices as superstition, but there was also a remarkable practicality in them. The desert climate was harsh. Dust-clogged pores, lice-infested hair, heat brought sweat and odor. Shaving heads, washing linen, and using oils were effective solutions to real problems. Even without modern science, Egyptians intuitively grasped the connection between hygiene and health. Their bodies were better protected against infection, parasites, and skin conditions because of these routines. What they called purity, we might call prevention. At the same time, we should not overlook the psychological comfort hygiene must have provided. In a world where life was short and uncertain, where the Nile's flooding could mean feast or famine, cleanliness offered a sense of control. To wash away sweat and dust, to perfume the body, to wrap oneself in bright linen, these were small victories against the disorder of existence. Each act of cleanliness restored order, if only for a few hours. In this way, hygiene was not merely physical. It was emotional and spiritual reassurance. The echoes of these habits reach into our world today. The word cosmetic itself comes from cosmos, meaning order, an idea deeply resonant with Egyptian practice. The deodorants, perfumes, and skincare products we use every day trace their lineage back to the oils and natron of the Nile. Even the cultural expectation of bathing regularly, now so ingrained in modern life, was once unusual in the ancient world. Rome had its baths, but Egypt lived daily with its river. Their model of hygiene influenced not only their neighbors but, eventually, the very way we think about cleanliness. And yet, the question remains, did these routines truly free Egyptians from worry, or did they impose new burdens? Was the priest who shaved his body 4 times a day liberated, or trapped in ritual obligation? Was the farmer's wife, scrubbing linen on river rocks, empowered by cleanliness, or weighed down by endless repetition? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Cleanliness was both necessity and ritual, both burden and comfort. As this story closes, one thought lingers. Hygiene in Egypt was never just about removing dirt. It was about crafting identity, preserving order, and preparing for eternity. To cleanse the body was to align with the gods, to honor society, and to soothe the anxieties of life. It was, in its quiet persistence, one of the most powerful and enduring legacies of the Nile. And so the final question is this: when we step into our showers today, lathering soap and applying perfume, are we truly so different from the Egyptians, or are we still reenacting their ancient pursuit of purity, repeating rituals that link us across 4,000 years of history? When you think of ancient Egypt, the images that first come to mind may not be pyramids or pharaohs, but faces lined with black kohl eyeliner, eyes elongated in sharp curves, gazes that seem eternal. These images are so familiar on tomb paintings, statues, and surviving artifacts that makeup has become one of the most enduring symbols of Egyptian culture. But makeup was not merely decoration. It was medicine, protection, ritual, and identity. To understand the place of cosmetics in Egyptian life, we must first imagine the materials at hand. The desert provided minerals that became pigments. Malachite, a green copper ore, was ground into powders. Galena, a form of lead sulfide, produced a dark, almost metallic black. Red ochre came from iron-rich soils, while blue pigments were mixed from lapis lazuli imported from distant Afghanistan. These substances, collected from mines and trade routes, were not luxuries restricted to the elite. Archaeological digs show that even modest households owned small cosmetic jars and applicators. Makeup, like cleanliness, crossed class lines. The most iconic cosmetic was kohl, the black substance painted around the eyes. Applied with slender sticks of wood, bone, or bronze, kohl framed the eyes in bold lines. But why? Scholars suggest several reasons. Practically, the dark pigment reduced glare from the desert sun, much like modern athletes apply black under their eyes. Medically, kohl had antibacterial properties, helping to prevent eye infections common in a land of dust and river water. Spiritually, the painted eyes were thought to ward off evil spirits, especially the evil eye. Thus, every stroke of kohl carried layers of meaning, practical, medicinal, and protective. Eye makeup was not limited to black. Green malachite, symbolizing fertility and rebirth, was also applied to eyelids. Tomb paintings show noble women with shimmering green lids beneath heavy black outlines, creating a striking contrast. The colors were not random. Green was linked to Horus, the falcon god of healing, while black symbolized protection and rebirth. To wear these colors was to place one's body in harmony with divine forces. Even in the quiet moments of daily life, cosmetics tied the individual to cosmic order. Women applied rouge made from red ochre to their cheeks and lips. This subtle coloring signaled vitality and beauty. Nail and hand treatments also existed. Henna, a plant-based dye, was used to color nails and fingertips a reddish brown. Wealthier Egyptians polished their nails to a shine, using tools of ivory or bronze. These practices, small as they may seem, reflected deeper values: health, liveliness, and refinement. A pale, colorless face might suggest weakness or illness, a painted one signaled energy and divine favor. But how did Egyptians view the act of applying makeup itself? In elite households, the process was ceremonial. Women sat before polished copper mirrors, attendants grinding pigments on stone palettes, mixing powders with animal fat or gum resin to create pastes. The application was slow and deliberate. A line of kohl was drawn not in haste but with intention, shaping the face into something more than human. Cosmetics boxes found in tombs, crafted from alabaster or carved wood, inlaid with ivory, reveal the care given to storing these materials. To paint the face was to engage in ritual, transforming the body into a reflection of cultural ideals. For men, too, cosmetics played a role. Soldiers and officials are depicted wearing kohl, not as vanity, but as protection. A man's lined eyes were as practical as a woman's painted cheeks. Even children were sometimes adorned, both for health and for protection against evil spirits. Cosmetics were not divided strictly by gender. They belonged to the culture as a whole, part of the shared vocabulary of appearance. Temples reinforced these practices. Statues of gods and goddesses were painted with kohl and pigments just as humans were. To anoint and adorn a statue was to enliven it, to make it a true vessel of the divine. This mirrored the human body itself, painted, perfumed, and cared for as though it, too, could channel sacred power. Makeup blurred the line between human and divine, making every face a canvas of cosmic expression. The social significance of cosmetics cannot be overstated. To appear in public without kohl-lined eyes or without clean linen was to risk being seen as careless, even disrespectful. Beauty and cleanliness were linked to morality. A well-kept body suggested discipline, order, and reverence for the gods. An unpainted face might suggest neglect of one's duties. Even among the lower classes, who could not afford imported pigments, there was effort to maintain appearance with simpler, locally available materials. What is fascinating is how Egyptians perceived beauty itself. Unlike some cultures that prized natural appearance, Egypt celebrated enhancement. To alter the body with pigment was not deceit, it was refinement. The act of painting the eyes was no different from wearing linen or shaving the head. It was about presenting oneself properly, in alignment with social and cosmic expectations. Beauty was not a personal choice but a communal responsibility. Still, beneath the ritual and meaning, there must have been moments of simple human vanity. A young woman admiring her reflection in a copper mirror, a soldier carefully reapplying kohl before heading to the fields, a mother painting her daughter's eyes with green malachite before a festival. These gestures remind us that, beyond religion and medicine, cosmetics carried emotional weight. They made people feel confident, attractive, prepared. This human layer connects us across time. And so we return to the painted eyes on statues and tomb walls, eyes that stare across millennia. They are not merely decoration. They are records of a culture that saw beauty, health, and divinity as inseparable. They remind us that to line the eye, to color the lip, to polish the nail, was to participate in something vast and enduring. But one question lingers as this first section closes. If the first section introduced us to the colors, powders, and brushes of Egyptian makeup, this second section must explore the deeper structures that sustained these practices, the workshops where pigments were made, the trade routes that carried rare minerals, the rituals of application, and the cultural meanings hidden within every jar of kohl or rouge. To begin, let us consider the manufacture of cosmetics. Archaeologists have uncovered palettes, pestles, and grinding stones from domestic houses, indicating that many households prepared their own pigments. Malachite was ground into fine dust, then mixed with oils or fats to make a paste. Galena, darker and heavier, required careful grinding, producing the smooth black lines seen in countless wall paintings. The process was laborious but precise. Grinding too roughly left gritty particles that irritated the skin. Skilled hands, whether of servants or family members, turned stone into powder, powder into cosmetic, and cosmetic into beauty. Yet not all ingredients were locally sourced. The presence of lapis lazuli, a vivid blue stone found only in distant Afghanistan, reveals the role of long-distance trade in Egyptian beauty. Caravans and ships brought stones, resins, and oils into the Nile Valley. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Punt, modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, cedar oil from Lebanon, all became part of Egyptian perfumes and ointments. The luxury of imported colorants was a visible marker of status. To wear blue pigments on one's eyelids was not simply aesthetic, it declared access to networks that spanned thousands of miles. Workshops dedicated to cosmetics existed in temple precincts and elite households. Temple laboratories, often run by priests, produced perfumes and ointments used for both ritual and personal adornment. Recipes were written on papyri, blending herbs, resins, and minerals with meticulous ratios. Some perfumes were reserved for gods alone, locked away in sanctuaries. Others were used by queens and nobles, whose bodies were perfumed daily as part of their morning routines. The scent of a wealthy Egyptian household would have been strong, resinous, sweet, and layered with imported oils. Application was itself a form of artistry. Cosmetic sticks made from ivory or bronze were dipped into pigment jars, then drawn carefully along the eyelids. Small spoons, carved from wood or bone, lifted powders from containers. Jars of alabaster or faience, shaped like animals or lotus flowers, revealed the aesthetic value of even the containers. Cosmetics were not stored carelessly. They were treasured objects, placed in decorated boxes, sometimes gifted as part of a bride's dowry. The tools of beauty became heirlooms, connecting generations. But cosmetics were not only for the living. Tombs reveal cosmetic palettes, jars of rouge, and kohl containers placed beside the deceased. The Book of the Dead often described the afterlife as a place where the dead continued their daily habits, eating, working, feasting, and, of course, adorning themselves. To deny a woman her kohl or a man his perfumes in death would have been unthinkable. They required these tools to appear properly before the gods. Makeup was not discarded at the grave, it was carried into eternity. The link between cosmetics and medicine deserves closer attention. Modern chemical analysis has confirmed that kohl, made from lead-based minerals, stimulated the production of nitric oxide in the skin. This helped fight eye infections, which were rampant along the Nile due to flies, dust, and contaminated water. What Egyptians understood intuitively, that kohl healed and protected, has now been validated by science. Similarly, resins and oils had antibacterial properties, reducing skin irritations and soothing wounds. The boundary between beauty and medicine was thin, perhaps non-existent. Every cosmetic was also a treatment. Every treatment was also an enhancement. Cosmetics also carried magical associations. The Eye of Horus, a powerful protective symbol, echoed the painted eyes of humans. To line one's eyes in black was, in a sense, to embody the divine eye that saw and warded off evil. Ritual texts describe the anointing of statues with makeup as an act of renewal, restoring power to the deity. This mirrored the daily routines of men and women painting themselves, renewing their vitality each morning with lines of kohl and smears of rouge. Beauty was a spell, cast each day against chaos. The communal nature of cosmetics also shaped identity. Festivals were moments when entire communities painted themselves for celebration. Imagine the streets of Thebes or Memphis during a festival for Hathor, goddess of love and beauty, women with bright cheeks, men with lined eyes, children perfumed with lotus oil. The collective transformation of faces and bodies reinforced unity. No one appeared in their unadorned state. To participate in society was to share in its beauty rituals. And yet, cosmetics also signaled status and individuality. The quality of pigments, the rarity of oils, the decoration of jars, all spoke of wealth. A noblewoman's kohl box might be carved of ivory, while a peasant used a simple clay pot. The difference was not only economic but symbolic. To own luxury cosmetics was to declare one's closeness to the court, to foreign trade, to divine favor. Even so, the persistence of makeup across all classes reveals its universal importance. Whether with clay pots or alabaster jars, everyone participated in the culture of adornment. One must not forget the role of mirrors. Polished discs of copper or bronze, sometimes inlaid with silver, provided reflections for application. These mirrors, often mounted on handles shaped like lotus flowers or Hathor heads, were works of art. To look into such a mirror was not a casual act. It was a moment of self-confrontation, of shaping one's identity. In the gleam of copper, a person did not just see their face, they saw the ideal they sought to become. The mirror, like the cosmetic, was both tool and symbol. But there is another side to this story. Lead-based kohl, though medicinal in small doses, could become toxic with heavy use. Continuous exposure to lead may have weakened health over time. Similarly, perfumes mixed with resins and fats could irritate skin. The pursuit of beauty was not without cost. Yet Egyptians accepted these risks, or perhaps did not perceive them, so deeply were cosmetics tied to identity and survival. To appear without makeup would have been unthinkable, no matter the hidden dangers. Thus, Egyptian cosmetics occupied a paradoxical space, at once practical and symbolic, protective and risky, ordinary and divine. They were daily routines and eternal provisions, medical treatments and magical charms. To grind malachite, to line the eyes, to scent the body, these acts were ordinary, yet they carried extraordinary meaning. As this section draws to a close, another question lingers. We have traced the powders and pigments of Egyptian cosmetics from the grinding stones of households to the luxury jars of queens, from the medicinal uses of kohl to the shimmering green malachite of temple rituals. To conclude, we must now step back and see how these practices shaped not only the lives of Egyptians but also their vision of eternity, their memory in history, and their echoes in our own world. Cosmetics in Egypt were inseparable from the concept of identity. Every morning, as men and women lined their eyes and rouged their cheeks, they were not merely preparing to face the day. They were crafting the self they wished to present, to their families, their neighbors, their gods. Identity was not something given, it was something made, polished daily like copper mirrors. The hand that drew kohl around an eye was also drawing the boundary between order and chaos, between belonging and neglect. The afterlife amplified this sense of identity. Tombs preserve not only the tools of makeup but the images of painted faces. Wall paintings depict the deceased with perfect cosmetics, eternally adorned. In the imagination of Egypt, beauty was not fleeting. It was a quality to be carried into eternity, preserved against decay just as the mummified body was preserved against death. To appear before Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, one had to be clean, perfumed, and painted. The body itself was an offering, and cosmetics were part of its sanctification. One cannot separate this from the role of gender and power. Queens like Nefertiti became icons of beauty, their sculpted and painted faces immortalized in stone. Yet makeup was not limited to women. Pharaohs, priests, and common men also lined their eyes. Unlike in later cultures, where cosmetics became gendered, in Egypt they were universal. This universality reflected the belief that beauty was not a luxury but a duty. To appear adorned was to align with Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Both men and women shared in this obligation. The symbolism of cosmetics also shaped politics. When a pharaoh appeared in public, his face painted, his eyes bold with kohl, his body perfumed with imported oils, he was not simply beautified, he was sacralized. His appearance reinforced his connection to the gods. The people saw not just a man but a divine figure. In this way, cosmetics were part of royal propaganda. They projected strength, order, and cosmic favor. A disheveled ruler would have been unimaginable. The painted face was as necessary as the crown. The psychological comfort cosmetics provided cannot be overlooked. In a world of uncertainty, floods, droughts, disease, painting the body offered stability that a soldier might face battle with kohl-lined eyes, a farmer might endure the blazing sun with pigments that doubled as protection, a mother might line her child's eyes against evil spirits. These acts provided reassurance. Even if danger could not be banished, it could be resisted. Every line of pigment was a defense, every jar of perfume a shield. The artistry of cosmetics also shaped Egyptian aesthetics more broadly. The bold lines, contrasts of black and green, polished bronze mirrors, these visual traditions influenced Egyptian painting, sculpture, and even hieroglyphs. The emphasis on eyes, for example, appears again and again in art. The human face became a template for cosmic symbolism. To paint the eye was to amplify its meaning, the gateway of the soul, the locus of divine protection, the very symbol of Horus. But what did ordinary Egyptians think as they painted themselves? Did they reflect on cosmic order, or did they simply feel the small satisfaction of seeing their reflection improve? Perhaps both. Culture often works this way, deep meanings coexist with simple pleasures. A noblewoman admiring her green eyelids might have felt both attractive and spiritually protected. A worker applying kohl before the fields might have been less concerned with beauty than with glare and flies. Yet, through repetition, both participated in the same cultural web, binding practical needs to spiritual meaning. Over time, cosmetics even influenced Egypt's neighbors. Trade spread Egyptian practices into the Levant, Nubia, and beyond. Greek travelers noted Egyptian devotion to appearance. Later, Roman writers admired and mocked their use of cosmetics. What was everyday in Egypt seemed excessive elsewhere. Yet echoes of Egyptian makeup lived on, in the eyeliner of Middle Eastern traditions, in the perfumes of the Mediterranean, even in the medical use of minerals. The Nile's painted eyes gazed outward, leaving marks far beyond its banks. Modern science has given new layers to this story. The discovery that kohl reduced infections, that oils softened skin, that perfumes had antiseptic properties, all confirms that Egyptians were not naive. They built a system of beauty that was also a system of health. Though they spoke in terms of gods and spirits, their practices were grounded in real benefits. The line between medicine and magic, so sharp for us, was blurred for them. In that blur lies their genius. As we close this journey through kohl and copper mirrors, a reflection lingers. Cosmetics were never trivial in Egypt. They were rituals of care, acts of identity, symbols of order. They carried the weight of medicine, magic, and aesthetics all at once. To paint the face was to enter into a cultural dialogue that spanned class, gender, and time. It was to claim a place within Ma'at, to resist chaos, to prepare for eternity. And so, when we gaze today at statues of Nefertiti or painted coffins in museums, we see not only beauty but a philosophy. The elongated eyes, the polished lips, the glimmering nails, they tell us that Egyptians believed the body itself was sacred, worthy of adornment, and inseparable from the soul. The final question, then, is not about them but about us. When we reach for eyeliner, lipstick, or perfume today, are we merely decorating ourselves, or are we, unknowingly, continuing an ancient Egyptian ritual, one that sought to protect, to heal, and to give eternal shape to the human face?